And now finally, let's get this event started. Earlier, I was talking about the approaching of the mobility transition from different perspectives, and therefore the program includes speakers with different backgrounds and discusses the mobility transition based on the following 5 pillars. It's policy and governance, technologies and infrastructures, markets, as well as culture and mobility patterns. Participants of the summer school should be equipped with the knowledge and skills about the developments, drivers and impacts across these 5 pillars. Moreover, the summer school takes an international perspective on the mobility transition, since the 5 pillars not only differ in various transport systems, but also between global regions. So with no further ado, please welcome our first speaker of this event. And my feeling is that he plays into all 5 pillars of the summer school, but you will be able to judge that by yourself after his presentation. It is the geographer Jens Schippl who has a talk prepared titled Towards Sociotechnical Transitions, Mobility Regimes Between Stability and Change. These presentations will be followed by a panel discussion, and it's about 40 minutes long. We just agreed on that. Academically, Mr. Schippl previously studied geography, biology, and sociology at Heidelberg University. And since 2006, he has been an active researcher at the Institute for Technology Assessment and Systems Analysis at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. His fields of expertise include sustainable transitions in mobility and energy, institutional and societal change and technology development, as well as digitalization, car sharing, and on-demand mobility. He's, amongst others, a member of the scientific staff at the Academy for Technology Assessment in Baden-Württemberg, as well as of the City Planning Office and the Office of Lokale Agenda 21 at the City Government of Heidelberg. Mr. Schippl is also a member of the scientific staff at Car Sharing Freiburg, where the focus is placed on new business models for sustainable transport. Mr. Schippl, you are well known for working in European projects which deal with trying to foresee future mobility trends, as well as your work in the field of transition studies. Which is why you are the perfect speaker to introduce the summer school now and answer the question, are we entering a phase of evolution or a phase of revolution? We are looking forward to your presentation and hope for an exciting discussion. The floor is all yours.
So, thank you for the nice introductory words. Thanks for inviting me to this exciting event. The title of my talk, Towards Societal Transition, Mobility Regimes Between Stability and Change, is already announced. I'm from the Institute of Technology Assessment and Systems Analysis in Karlsruhe. You see here already the first slide, motivation program. I think I need my glasses because I have to read it. It's very close. Okay, so I was asked to give some insights on concepts from transition research and how we use it in technology assessment. So my talk is strongly structured along these concepts from transition research. So I'm not going that deep into issues of mobility, but the structuring line for my talk actually is what you see here. As it will be a first part where I will introduce the multi-level perspective with regime, niches, and landscapes. And I try to people who are familiar with these concepts. And I have to admit that I always have problems to assess how long it takes me to give a presentation in this hybrid formats. So the first part is starting now, and you can see that I have written something about these 3 graphs: approaches from technology assessment to analyze and anticipate stability and change. In the mobility sector, this is actually at the heart of my research interests, and I try to tackle this from different perspectives, as you will see. And one of my key interests, to put it more concretely, actually, is do digitalization and automation really lead to significant changes in the mobility sector? Can we really expect a sustainable transition? And what are the conditions actually to achieve such a transition? And as I already announced, you will see that I jump a little bit through the different areas of the mobility sector and also geographically from urban areas to rural areas. Really the structural line are these concepts from transition research. Okay, how do I get to the next slide? Yeah, okay. So what I usually like to start with when I talk about mobility, particularly urban mobility in Germany, is a statement, a position paper from the German Association of Cities. So this is something that all cities have to agree on. It's a joint paper. And I think they describe the recent situation and the perspectives quite well. So the number and the relative share of users of the environmental alliance, this is a term in Germany that we use to describe public transport, cycling and walking. So the share of the environmental alliance is increasing in cities and metropolitan areas against the nationwide trend. But still for the environmental alliance, the expansion curves and the design qualities are often insufficient. The traffic volumes of the public transport system is increasing, yes, but we did not have a noticeable change in model split over the last decades. So actually not that much happened if you look at it from this perspective. Digitalization of transport, this is already mentioned, this is also mentioned by the Association of German Cities. Digitalization in the public and private realms must be focused on a more efficient utilization, optimization, and interlinking of existing transport systems. And of course, there's a huge potential to integrate new modes of transport. And the vision is then to have more livable cities of the future, which are pictured with less cars and much space for pedestrians and cyclists. So if you look at this again, I took here the figures for Karlsruhe, the model split for Karlsruhe, where you can see the share of the different modes. So I just realized that it's in German. The blue color is for cars, the red is for walking, the green one for cycling, and public transport is violet. So you can see that there really has been a progress between 2002 and 2012 in Karlsruhe. But it's rather an evolution than a revolution so far. And if we look at the state of Baden-Württemberg, so which is in between the federal state of Germany, there we have these states, and which is the next level above Karlsruhe, so to speak, then you can see that there is not that much change actually. If you look at the red colors, this is cars as driver, there has not been that much change over the last 20 years. So there is an inertia in the system, but there seems to be opportunities to overcome this inertia. And of course, one of these opportunities is digitalization. So again, something very basic to make clear what I'm talking about. We have three different, or we usually discuss that we have three different strategies towards sustainable mobility. You can improve mobility. You can integrate cleaner fuels, hydrogen or electric mobility. You can try to induce a shift to less environmental damaging modes of transport, like public transport, cycling and walking. And you can try to avoid mobility, so which is a new, a topic which has a new importance now in the COVID-19 area. So what I talk about when I talk about digitalization here, I mainly talk about a model shift. I do not talk about improves. This does not mean that this is not important, but it's just not the subject of my talk. And so again, the basic idea or the basic question, do digitalization and automation rather lead to incremental changes? So private cars might be slightly reduced, or does it really take us to a transition? So private cars are private car use and ownership is heavily reduced, and we can see a new structure dominating the system. And with this new structure dominating the system, we already enter the language of transition research. I think one of the basic ideas, and that's also because we in the field of technology assessment feel very attracted to these ideas and try to use them and integrate them in our research. One of the basic ideas is that infrastructures are actually socio-technical systems. So it's not only technical factors that matter for the future development in energy, water, and transport. It's also about demand patterns, user acceptance, user commitment, planning paradigms, actor constellation, business models, mega trends such as aging and individualization. So actually this kind of thinking has its roots in evolutionary economics, structuration theory, science and technology studies. And there are also some common roots with some branches of technology assessment called here constructive technology assessment. So one of the basic ideas is this co-evolution between technical and non-technical factors. And of course, there are a lot of quite famous authors that could be listed here. I just listed a few of them. And at the heart of this thinking is the idea of the socio-technical regime. The regime is the rule set, the grammar, the routinized practices, the way of defining problems, the skills that align, and this idea of alignment is really important, so that different factors of very different character actually align to such a configuration that works and that enable to provide functions like energies, that we have energy in this room, mobilities that I was able to travel here, and so on. So transitions then mean changes in the deep structures of a socio-technical regime of such a system. So it's a kind of configurational thinking as well. There's a lot of complexity, which is, of course, a challenge for TA and transition research. So one of the key concepts that has been developed over the last years by Frank Reels and others is the so-called multi-level perspective. And so you have to go through 3 slides, which is very conceptual. So now we'll come with examples. The multi-level perspective, it has these 3 levels with different, well, let's say degrees in stability, to keep it simple. The regime is at the core of a socio-technical system. It's, as I already mentioned, the way things are done in the normal, the rule sets, the grammar, the routinized practices, skills, ways of defining problems. And we have here a rather stable, deeply institutionalized configuration that works. And above that, or around it, there is a sort of context, a landscape. There's a long-term changes that can hardly be influenced by actors in the core of the regime. And we have here broader societal trends like geopolitical developments, climate change, COVID-19 would have to be added here. And of course, there is some space left for the niche spaces for innovation. This is where new things are happening. These are areas, fields which are less stable, which are more fluctuative, and which are at least partly different from the regime. You have a difference to the normal. We have protected spaces for innovative approaches. You have actually highly dynamic fields. And now you can use these 3 levels to map dynamics that are going on. And one of the famous pictures that is used in this context is the ones that I show here, where you can see the socio-technical regime in the middle with the markets, industry, policy, technology, culture, and science interacting and aligning to this stable configurations that work. And now you can have pressure, which is induced by changing values, for example, environmental qualities, cost for energy, or maybe something like Fukushima in the energy sector. You can have pressure from the landscape, and you can have pressure which is induced by innovations, so which leads to cracks in the systems. This can be expectations linked with digitalization, mobility platforms, automation, all these new things that are emerging at the moment, which may lead to a destabilization of established structures and of established mobility patterns. So now I can use this to describe what we can see at the moment. So as I said, it's a heuristic and it's not a theory. It just helps you to bring in some order in this complex field of mobility with a lot of factors interacting and working towards evolution or revolution. You can see for the moment in the landscape, digitalization, which co-evolves with societal trends, sharing economy, virtualization, urbanization. We have this Friday for Futures development, concerns on climate change, pollution, health, quality of urban life that start to matter more heavily. And of course, COVID-19 would have to be added here in the next years as another factor. In the regime, I just listed some examples. We can observe that urban planning paradigms have changed over the last years. We had this idea of car-friendly cities in the 1950s and 60s, at least in Germany and in other European countries, which is now substituted by sustainability. Most cities have something like sustainable development on their transport development plans. Another example is that we have a growing number of younger adults that seems to be less interested in cars. And we can observe these slow but significant changes in the model splits that I already have shown for Karlsruhe, which become normal and established. And then we have all these developments that we can observe in the niche, if you want so. Like new forms of car sharing schemes, ride sharing, bike sharing. We have approaches like ShareNow, which are driven by former automotive companies, or by automotive companies. Also Moja is a spin-off of Volkswagen. We have Uber, Lyft, BlaBlaCar. So it can be an endless list, and actually it's pretty hard to keep it on time because some of these companies are already gone. New ones are emerging. For example, Movil does not exist anymore. I removed it this morning. So there's an incredible dynamic in this field, actually. There are so many new things emerging. And another thing is this idea of mobility as a service, that we have integrated mobility system that you go into a city and you can book with one app all these different modes like scooters, bike sharing, car sharing, and public transport, which is emerging as a new concept, as a new paradigm. So many experts on this basis actually expect that we will now have a stronger shift in urban mobility patterns than we have experienced over the last decades. And behind this idea, a little bit placative maybe, is that you can see here, those from Germany will know these figures maybe. You can see here the growth rates in car sharing. I just explain the red bars, which is the number in people which are allowed to be, which are registered actually, if they use or not, which are registered for car sharing. And you can see that this number is increasing up to 1.6, 1.8 millions, and it was rapidly increasing over the last years. And of course, the idea is that all these will develop in future into something like you can see on the smaller pictures, these robo shuttles. These are two shuttles that have just been tested in Karlsruhe area for public service. And that this will be the future, that we all in urban areas are attracted or motivated to use these new forms of automated mobility integrated into a broader transport mobility, a public transport system. So this is the one side of observations that you can have. But on the other side, you can also see facts and expectations that do not point towards significant change, that rather point towards stability in mobility regimes, actually, at least in Germany. You can see, and it could be a relatively long list. I just selected a few points here. So many urban mobility regimes are still dominated by privately owned cars. And of course, we have 25 car sharing cars and we have heavy growth rates in this field, but over 47 million private cars are still on the roads, and this number is growing as well. We have a high share in new sold cars, which are SUVs. And here it's clear it's not cost-benefit analysis alone that drives the purchase decision. There are emotions still involved in car transport. Public transport is the least popular mode. This is a result of a survey from 2018. And many young people still seem to be proud on their nicely tuned cars. So we still have a lot of stability here. And if you look at visions, expectations on how the future might look like, You can also find pictures like that, not only the robo-taxis. What you can see here is an ultra-private car, actually. It's not only that it's privately owned, it's also in a private living room. Of course, it's only a vision, but still it exists. So this is a complete contrast, the opposite of car sharing. Here, future cars are discussed as these third places. So the third place, which is a nice place where you could cocoon in with the third place between the first place, which is your home, and the second place, which is or has been before COVID your working place. You have this third place where you feel safe, nice, and warm. And all this indicates that the regime still seems to be pretty stable. And so the future remains uncertain, of course. Yeah, we have some changes in mobility patterns, and it's very likely that further changes are coming. But it's still not sure if there will be a real transition, such the deep structures of the system, how it is organized in urban areas and beyond, is really changing. So it's just not clear if we get to this Karlsruhe 2035. It's just some fictive numbers to illustrate how the model split might change until then. Taxi and sharing is the light blue color. Well, it could be some robotaxis or whatever, but still we are not sure if we get there. And I think we have indications in the system that point towards change, but we have also indicators that point towards stability. So what to do with this situation? Well, I just want to briefly show you the results of the interview study that we did in a project that was following up on these observations. We try to talk to actors which are actually providing new mobility services, car sharing, bike sharing, new forms of public transport, and ask them how they see the future, if they think that all these new services will lead to a different mobility sector, because we thought these people should actually be rather enthusiastic about the potential impacts of their services. So we did here 10 interviews in Stuttgart region with providers of new and innovative mobility services, as I just mentioned. The research question was, do actors in the field expect that processes of digitalization enable new services that are so attractive that a transition of urban mobility systems takes place without strong government intervention? And it's also related to some concepts from transition research to this fit and conform and stretch and transform idea. So there is the idea that innovations, there can be two pathways for innovations to make their way to the regime. Fit and conform empowerment is understood as a process that makes niche innovations competitive with mainstream socio-technical practices in otherwise unchanged selection environments. So this would mean that this technology is just gaining market shares without strong changes in the structures of the system. And the stretch and transform pathway or empowerment implies that the growth and diffusion of the innovative practices interferes with other processes of change within the regime and in the broader society. So just a few quotes from the interviews. So the smartphone is a new key to mobility system. It will be a revolution that will also change society. We had voices like that, but we also had more skeptical voices, like for many younger people, cars are still interesting and associated with fun. After decades of pilot projects with ride pooling in Germany, it still hardly works among employees of a company. Why should it work with strangers? Nobody will implement congestion charge or inner city tolls in Stuttgart, since it would mean political demise. Acceptance for restrictive measures can hardly be found, and this will not change in future. So the results are actually, and I think I can pretty much agree with that, to reflect my own perspectives. There are many doubts that a voluntary decline of private car use in cities will come. Most of these experts agreed that strong policies are needed to break habits and routines of users, if you want so, yes. Otherwise, mass is here for mobility as a service will not dominate the regime. Most argued that restrictions for car mobility are desirable, but not likely, because it's hard to implement them because of a lack of societal and political acceptance for strategies changing the deep structures of the system. So to conclude, so far, I think there is a window of opportunity, but fit and conform is not enough to achieve a transition. New services are definitely necessary. So we need all these new technologies and all these new services. This is necessary, but not sufficient. Restrictive policies, from my perspective, seems to be necessary as well. And here we run into another thing which is necessary. We need societal and political acceptance for these restrictive measures. Otherwise, I do not see that we will reach a transition in sense of deep structural changes. And this is something that the Association of German Cities, which I mentioned in the beginning, has, although on their agenda, there must be a broad political and societal consensus for achieving sustainable mobility for all, and it must be a consensus that is instrumental in promoting change, conversion, and renewal. And I think this is another project that we just started with. I think this is something which you may think it's a little bit over-exaggerated, actually. Well, we did interviews with citizens in Karlsruhe, and we tried to get their opinion on these three necessary conditions. What do they think about new services? What do they think about restrictions? But what are the conditions for the acceptance of restrictions? And here we try to get a better understanding, what kind of city do people actually want? What kind of urban area is preferred? Of course, you get a variety of opinion, but still you get some indications that what we show here, of course, is not desirable. I think for most of us, it's too dense. It was just a trigger for the debate to come into a discussion with the people, you know, and to make them to visioning and thinking about how it might be in the future. But I think this kind of research is missing beside all these new technologies and services that we have to test in real laboratory settings and so on. But we also have to discuss about what makes actually quality of life, quality of urban life, and what is a kind of what is an upgrade in urban design from different perspectives. So now I would actually shift briefly maybe to the second part if there is still some time left. Oh, yeah, we have 25 minutes. So as I said from my preparatory talks with the organizers, I learned that it would be appreciated if I could talk a little bit more about how we further developed or extended the regime concept. So I still have a few rather conceptual slides, and after that I think I will stop it and open the floor for questions. So I talked very much about urban transport now in this first 25 minutes, and I tried to illustrate how we in technology assessment try to use this idea of regimes, niches, and landscape to map future developments and to bring a certain structure in this complexity of factors. But of course, if you now look at this idea of the regime and you look at the transport sector, and you see here pictures from a city, it could be anywhere, it's Karlsruhe, and from a rural area, and this is completely different. And so we always struggled with this idea that this could be the same regime. Of course, you have similar elements. It's not something completely different. In all these pictures, you can see cars, public transport, you can use a cycle and you can walk there. But still, the structure of the system is pretty different. And you should also understand that in Germany, only about 30, maybe in the meantime, it's a little bit more, 32, 33% of the people live in the cities with more than 100,000 inhabitants. So what's happening in Berlin, Hamburg, and München, Dresden is important, but of course we have a lot of small and medium-sized cities, and we still have 25, 26% of the people living in the more rural areas. So it depends a little bit on the definition. Just take it as a rough indication. So together with Bernhard Ruffer, based on work from Mara van Wely, we try to adopt a concept here to better anticipate future developments in the transport system in different spatial settings. and to identify entry points for the governance of the system. So I will briefly introduce this, and I will show how this could be applied to the case of automated driving, which gives me the opportunity to make some final remarks on the future prospects of automated driving as I see it. The idea here is to differentiate between two levels in a regime, between a service and a sectoral level. The service regime is a specific institutionalized combination of technology, user routines, and organized forms for providing the service. And the sectoral regime is a broader economic or societal realm that covers a societal function such as mobility. And again, the idea of alignment is very important here. Service, on the service level, you need to have an alignment between some core dimensions. I will explain. Of the service regime, and on a sectoral level, you need the alignment between the service regimes. And you can roughly see it here in these small pictures. Actually, it was originally developed and applied to the sanitation regime in Nairobi, but we adopted it and used it for transport. You can see these large bubbles, which are the sectoral regimes, and in it you have the service regimes, and they can be aligned and combined in different ways. Now, if you try to transfer this to the mobility sector, you can say you have a couple of service regimes, and we differentiated here between private cars, public transport, which is quite intuitive. Taxis, ride sharing, we took as one, sharing schemes, and car rental because you have to drive yourself. We took as another one, cycling and walking. So we come up with 6. And in these regimes, you have a sort of core dimensions, which are in the one or the other form quite often used in transition research. So as we combined it here, we differentiate between technologies and infrastructures, the organizational mode, user requirements, user expectations, interests of users to have access to functioning, reliable, affordable, safe, clean, and convenient mobility, but also planning practices, the planning paradigms that I mentioned before, and societal meaning, which is of course very important when it comes to allocate resources to a certain form of mobility. Do we build roads or do we build public transport? And is there a connotation with sustainability, with health, with freedom, or with climate change? So examples for good alignment, you have cars in rural areas, it works perfect. You might have some misalignment with user expectations towards clean transport, maybe, depending on what kind of car you have. But of course, it can be easily organized. You find a parking space, there is place and space, and public transport in urban areas. Of course, you have as well a high degree in alignment. Misalignment, of course, cars in the city centers where it's too narrow, you don't find a parking place, you have congestion and so on. Public transport in rural areas, because in many cases it just does not exist. So now you can try to map that and try to identify different degrees and alignment. And the basic motivation here actually was to make the differences between urban and rural areas more explicit. So you can see here that we have, for example, the private car, which is partly aligned because in urban areas because of congestion, a lack of parking, pollution, waste of space, and so on. And you have a higher degree in alignment in rural areas. That's why we used another symbol here, aligned, but clear drawbacks remain. And here you have it aligned and highly institutionalized. Environmental impacts remain problematic, but it works quite well. So this is a service level, and then you can continue and look at the sectoral regimes, so the broader economic or societal realms that cover a function such as mobility. You can focus on here the focus is on the overall system, its character and performance. The sectoral regime consists of service regimes. Alignment of misalignment between the service regimes is here central. So then you can come up with such pictures. Of course, on the one side, you see the urban areas where private cars are dominating to a certain extent, but other modes of transports are important as well, like public transport, car sharing, bike sharing, walking. they are not only important, they are necessary for a functioning urban mobility system. You cannot imagine a Dresden or any city with only cars. It just would not work. So you definitely need the other ones. In rural areas, as we have it today, you have a different composition of service and sectoral regimes. Of course, the private car is dominating much more there. Now, if you try to apply this to a case like autonomous vehicles in AVs, is here the abbreviation for autonomous vehicles in different spatial settings. You can see that various levels in may know that various levels in automation are discussed and expected. I just focus here on driverless cars who do not have a steering wheel. So to keep it simple, so you can have two visions actually, which are observable. This correspond a little bit to those that I introduced before. You can have this cocooning vision in a third place, so that automated vehicles are used as a private car. Highly comfortable one, or the other extremes, there's much in between, of course, are these robotaxis or service shuttles. So different developments now may emerge in different spatial settings. This is the idea of this kind of thinking. In urban areas, AVs, automated vehicles, may strengthen the integration of the sectoral level. And in rural areas, automated vehicles may also strengthen the service regime of private cars. So you can come up with kind of small scenarios here. I just go briefly through it. AVs may lead to better alignment in and between service regimes in rural areas. They may fill gaps in public transport services, may strengthen the public transport regime, but may also improve the alignment. Now you can use this language between non-private car transport modes. So they can strengthen alternatives to private cars. Policies to restrict car usage, this brings us back to these acceptance issues, may get better aligned, so you have a better chance to get restrictions implemented. So push and pull towards seamless mobility could be in effect in urban areas, and you might enter such self-reinforcing dynamics, so where the attractiveness of alternatives to car mobility are steadily increasing, so the attractiveness of car is steadily decreasing, and it makes it easier to implement corresponding policies. So a quite sustainable pathway in rural areas. I think we cannot just adopt this concept that we see or these settings that we see in urban areas. So it's a different situation. The internal alignment of the car regime could be strengthened by third place cars, yes, which will weaken public transport. You can even run into a self-reinforcing effect that goes towards less sustainability. Some improvements in the internal alignment of public transport and ride sharing are imaginable as well. Of course, flexible economic and variable mobility. And it may lead to some better alignment of the sectoral level, but of course there's a certain likeliness that the dominance of the car will not be broken. Of course, all these are in a way scenarios, and I think what this can be used for is, for example, for a workshop or for discussions to continue and further develop it. But the point that I actually want to make is that we try to use here this idea of regime of changes in a way that we are able to differentiate between different geographical settings. And as I said before, I think this is highly important and necessary if we want to come to sustainable mobility. We cannot only talk about urban mobility. So this is yes, that's what I said before, sectoral regimes with automated vehicles in urban and rural areas. Now you can map it like that. You can see this yellow circle, service regimes affected by automated vehicles. And you can map these different dynamics that you may have in urban and rural areas. So some conclusions and further question, depending on whether the early innovation strategies are oriented in rural or urban contexts, quite different directionalities or kinds of restructuring of the system or the regime can result. Regarding the technological trajectories of the new service options, so the automated vehicles might be developed technically in different ways. But also regarding the overall sector configurations, the system or the regime, the mobility regime could be developed in different ways. So the approach helps to map and analyze the spatial differences, and it helps to identify needs and anti-policy options for spatially different governance strategies. So, okay, so I think I have to stop here, and just to add some final remarks, I think, or to summarize, I think it's quite clear that we will have changes in a country like Germany in the next years, but if it becomes a revolution or if it remains an evolution, I think it strongly depends on the political will. It's not the technologies, actually. In the end, it's a societal decision. It's a question about what future mobility system is desirable from our perspective. And I don't think that without strong political interventions, we will really have a restructuring of the system. I think also automated vehicles, they really provide an immense window of opportunity. They really offer us new possibilities to provide flexible and affordable public transport. But still, at the same time, the attractiveness of private cars will be increased as well. So it really depends on a societal decision, to my understanding, where we will go and if it will be a revolution or an evolution. Okay, I stop it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schippl, for this very exciting presentation. And even though we made up that each moderator has the first question, I think you addressed it already in a good way. And since you have only 15 minutes for discussion left, I suggest that we take now questions from the audience. Questions from you guys out in the world, we will answer via our chat here. I can read filtered messages and I can answer them, pass them to Jens Schippl. So go ahead with your questions.
Already you've got a question in the chat.
Then I would need to get them here, which I did not get yet. Well, this is the question now. This is the question that was our first question, actually, that you addressed already. So if there are some questions from this room, go ahead, Felix.
Okay, yeah, thank you for this very interesting talk. I have a question which also concerns Karlsruhe a bit with the new decision from the Federal Court, from the BGH, regarding the new climate change law, which has very strict and ambitious goals for this law. Just to make, do you think this has a strong impact on the policies made and also will accelerate policy making towards changing the mobility will be more sustainable, maybe banning combustion engines, for example, and will this have an effect on the modal split as well, for example?
I think, yes.
Would you mind rephrasing, like shortly summarizing it?
Sorry, I don't know.
Okay. So the question was if there's a new a new decision from the Federal Court that the climate ambitions to implement climate change in Germany have to be accelerated. And so the question was if this will have an impact on mobility policies. And I think definitely in the field of cleaner mobility, I could well imagine that this will be implemented and that it might accelerate to a certain extent. And now here you have to be cautious, electric mobility, hydrogen, whatever, so alternative fuels and propulsion technologies. For modal split, I could imagine that the ambitions will be, it will increase the ambitions, but still, as you can hear from my talk, I mean, it's also 20 or more years that I work in this field, and in the 1990s already, I remember the first transport development plan of the city of Heidelberg with a strong ambition to increase public transport and so on and cycling. And there was success, of course, but still the car remained very important. So I think it can help, it will at least help to strengthen the evolution. But if it will really be the revolution, if we really want it, I think this remains open, from my understanding.
We got a question here from the chat. Do you think the changes in mobility pattern will stick? That means if people, will they keep on traveling less even when the pandemic is finally over one day?
Yes, it depends heavily on which kind of people, I think. If we look at urban areas, and actually I did not talk about this kind of research that we're doing, but we're having an interview program with citizens actually since 2 or 3 years, where we try to understand how mobility patterns are interlinked with the organization of daily life. Yes. And here, of course, if we have academics, we can really see that new options are emerging, that they discover new possibilities. But it does not always point into the same direction. Some of them start to use a car more often now through the pandemic and started to like it. Yeah. And whereas others got used to this home office situation, and it's a very heterogeneous picture that emerged there actually. And some of the jobs, I think only 40% of the jobs in Germany are suitable for home office. So you still have to go to the supermarket and to sell your stuff if this is your job, so you're going to do it from home. So it's a very heterogeneous picture, and I did not talk too much about that because to me it's just not clear at the moment how. I mean, it's a very interesting exercise from a scientific point of view, yes, a real life experiment, even if it's dramatic. But I don't see it really clear at the moment how this will. But I'm sure that we will have a higher share in home office, and we can also see that a lot of urban mobility, car-based urban mobility, this is what we learned from the interviews, that a lot of people actually have a car, not because of urban transport, because there is something to do outside urban areas. This might be a workplace, this might be a horse somewhere, this might be the football club or of the kids or whatever, and then they have it and then they use it. But if you ask them, well, why do we actually have it? Then most or many of them have it because of a reason which is outside. In cities like Karlsruhe, you know, that's with 200,000 to 300,000 inhabitants. And I could imagine that this is quite typical. So it depends also a little bit on how these activity patterns will, if they will remain stable or if they will change. If they might get more localized after the pandemic, or if it just will fall into the same rhythm as before. So it's difficult to answer from my perspective.
You should have a psychologist with you answering these questions in future.
But also they cannot look into the future. That's a problem.
But we have one in the audience, we can ask her. There was another question. Are robo-taxis meant only for urban mobility, or is this a possible solution for the rural areas as well?
Yes, this is I think in urban areas they may perfectly fit. And they will really fill a gap that we have because there is already a strong infrastructure and public transport infrastructure, and we in Germany, we don't use taxis that often. And if you really have an affordable and very flexible alternative in urban transport, well, why not? And I think they can really make a difference. I think it's much more difficult in rural areas, and then it depends as well on which kind of rural areas. So because we don't have, so people in a small village, they drive in very different directions. And I mean, for commuting into the city, it might help, but it will not really change that much the situation. I think there can be some improvements as well in rural areas, but here the situation is much more complicated. And as I said before, I could as well imagine that for somebody in a rural area who's driving a lot, well, in average, they are not driving that much more than people in urban areas, but they drive more and longer distances. But particularly for those people, it could be interesting to buy such a private robo-taxi. You want. So if it's achievable, if it's affordable. You know. I think there's a stronger competition in the rural areas between robo-taxis and all these flexible forms of public transport and advanced private car mobility.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I have a question about the impact, because I see in Germany on the federal level, we still do Bundesverkehrswegeplan, for example, with a lot of modeling, of course, benefit analysis. And what you presented is another type of knowledge that is, to my mind, very useful, very valuable to such decisions. But I have the feeling that policy making is still demanding or asking for another type of knowledge than what you are working on. How do you tackle that? And do you have these connections? And do you feel that this type of knowledge is having an impact, or how do you deal with it?
I think it's increasing. I mean, this idea of socio-technical systems. I mean, I'm working at Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. We have a lot of engineers and technically trained people around us. And if you come with this idea of socio-technical systems, some of them, what's that? And so this is already here. And but it's not like this anymore. I think that there's an interplay between societal factors and technical factors, and that there's no technical determinism, that society has a certain influence on how technologies develop. I think this becomes more and more widespread, first of all. And then, of course, there is the question, how can this be adopted to the established routines of planning and policy making? And there's still a gap, I can see that. And there are several trials, for example, to better implement this in traditional modeling approaches, you know, and for example, to try to use maybe this idea of a regime and institutional configuration. So on this idea on perceptions and expectations of people to weight, for example, the likeliness and the chance to implement certain strategies. I mean, there is I see a broad bundle of approaches, and there's also the idea to implement this idea of personal social networks, these activity patterns that I briefly mentioned just before the interviews that we do, to implement this, to connect this better to traditional transport modeling. But I think we're still not there. So I think there's a lot of room for improvements. And it's, in a way, it's an emerging field, this idea of socio-technical regimes, whatever dynamics, institutional change. And there's still some way to go. So there's a lot of work to do for you, maybe, so to try to find here ways to implement it, or to bring it closer to the traditional forms of to the established forms of planning and decision making.
We have another very interesting, almost philosophical question here. How would you measure whether a transition is real?
That's a good point. That's a very good point. I think this brings us back to this societal agreement that is needed, maybe on different levels. And maybe you remember that I've shown this model split for Karlsruhe, yes? And for example, I think something like that, this level of concreteness is missing in many urban areas. But you cannot just compare energy and mobility. But in Germany, in the energy transition, we had very clear targets. Now you can like them or not, but they are there. And you can see we want to, the target is 60% renewable energies until 2030, whatever, 80% until 2050. This is a pathway. So now you don't have to like, you know, but it is there. And you can see it. And such a kind of agreement for urban transport, for example, and also for regional, and we can discuss on which level is the best level to do it, such kind of clear targets and the clear agreement, a societal decision, we want that, is missing. So, and this should be then, this is an academic problem, if it's a real transition or not, yes. But I just try to talk about the real transition, but the not real transition, in the sense that just a soft evolution, a soft increase of the environmental alliance of public transport, cycling, walking. So it's not a transition for me as long as the basic structures of the system are not changed. But in the end, I think we should have societal targets, political targets, which define where we want to go and yeah.
I guess we have a follow-up question.
Yes. Thanks very much for a stimulating talk. I'm wondering if you say we need goals, and I would agree, politics needs goals, society needs goals. So what can science do to formulate these goals, or more concretely, is there any way to formulate a goal concerning model split, which is in line with climate goals? I mean, they are clearly formulated. Do you know of any research, or do you do it yourself perhaps, which would help us to formulate a goal which is consistent with climate goals?
I mean, there are some targets for mobility. Let's just well, urban mobility, for example. It has to be affordable. People have to be able to organize, to configure their life. They need a certain kind of freedom to choose where to go. So you cannot forbid everything. But what we do not fully understand at the moment is how this configuration, this texture of daily life is actually linked to certain modes of transport. And this is the kind of research that we are doing at the moment, that we try to better understand. For example, what are you doing? What have you done over the last 2 or 3 weeks? And what's the role of specific kinds of transport? And if I don't know where you live, but if you were living in an urban area, so if you take off your parking place, for example, or we say, well, in this area, you're not allowed to drive anymore, what does it actually mean for you? Is it really that you're restricted in something? Is it that you really miss something because you cannot reach your workplace, or you have problems to drive your children? So you really have a cut, something is cut away from your life, or is it just a little bit that, well, it's getting a little bit more complicated, but not really, you will get used to it anyway. And I think this kind of research to get a better understanding on what is actually acceptable and implementable, without bothering people too much, to put it simple. I think this kind of research is still missing, and this I think has also, and now there is this fashion, which is very good fashion actually, to talk about this Reallabor in German, about this English word, about this real world experiments, so to speak, and we have just to try it out, I think, in certain urban areas, and maybe test what happens actually, or what people are, how people react, or what visions or expectations they have, and then test if we take out the cars in an area, if we provide public transport there, if we try to make an urban upgrade, and so on. But really as an open experiment. And I think this is one of the fields that comes to my mind. And of course, then all this discussion about the diffusion and acceleration, acceptance of electric mobility, of alternative fuels and propulsion is another important topic, but I did not talk about this one. I think others are talking about that today.
We have one last question, and then I think we need to wrap up this session.
Does public opinion, does the media play any role in your research?
Does public opinion,
sticky behavior patterns?
does public opinion, does the media play a role? Yes, but it definitely plays a role, but we don't have, the focus of our research so far is not on the media. We plan a media analysis for automated vehicles, and I think that others have done already things in this field, and so it's important, but I cannot contribute to this at the moment very much. Part of the media, there's also the question today, what is actually the media?
Yes, always.
It's not only the printed stuff you go through the big newspapers, but you need to have a broader scope. So but of course, it's an important field for research, I agree.
Thank you very much. I have the feeling we could fill a whole summer school with you only, and the questions that come in and tackle your field from different sides as well. Thank you very much. I think we learned that the future is unclear, and that not even a psychologist can help out here, and that we have a long-term experience in front of us.
Okay.
And yeah, I guess we just need to know what we want to focus on right in the future, and what is the target.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schippl, for this very inspiring presentation, and I guess that all the people that still have questions, I had some more here, but the time was not enough. They can see your profile on our website and the connection to you as a speaker in contact.
Yes, of course, you're all invited to contact me via email, so it should not be a problem.
Okay. We will now enter a 15 minutes break. We start not exactly 15 minutes anymore, maybe 13 minutes break. We start at 10:45 again with our next session that focuses on the social sciences. Be free to meet in the breakout rooms, as I mentioned before, and in the next session we will welcome Professor Welstra from Groningen University, and Andrea Hauselbauer, one of our scholars here, will moderate this next session for you. Have a nice break and thank you very much.